The scent of ginger and star anise was a ghost in the dusty streets of Redemption, Nevada, a memory of a place half a world away. For Ann Jing, standing behind her small wooden cart, that scent was the only home she had left. At 18, with her parents taken by the fever that had swept through the rail camps a season ago, she was utterly alone. Her inheritance was a small collection of her mother's clay pots and a knowledge of cooking that was as much a part of her as the color of her eyes. So, she cooked. In the blistering summer of 1878, she set up her cart at the edge of the town's main square, a solitary figure in a plain gray prairie dress, her black hair pulled back in a severe, practical knot. The townsfolk of Redemption were not unkind, but they were wary. They bought her small meat-filled buns and skewers of grilled meat when they were in a hurry, transactions conducted with few words and quick glances. She was a curiosity, a silent girl who produced wonders from a steaming pot, but she was not one of them. She understood this. Acceptance was a luxury she could not afford to dwell on. Survival was the currency of her world. She kept her head down, measured her rice and her words with equal care, and prayed she earned enough each day to buy ingredients for the next. Then came the man the town called Jasper Thorne. He was not a loud man, nor a large one, but when he walked, a space cleared around him. He moved with a deliberate, unnerving stillness, his hands never far from the Colt peacemaker that rested on his hip. His face was weathered by sun and hardship, a geography of grim lines and old scars, but it was his eyes that held the town in a state of respectful fear. They were the color of a washed-out sky, and they missed nothing. He was a gunslinger, a man who made his living in the liminal spaces between law and lawlessness, and his reputation was as solid and unyielding as granite. For a week he had watched her. An Jing felt his gaze from across the square where he'd sit on the bench outside the land office, seemingly watching the world go by. He never approached, never gave any sign of his interest, but she knew he was observing her. The way the miners fumbled for their coins, the way the respectable ladies of the town hurried past her cart with their noses in the air, the way the children sometimes lingered, drawn by the smell. He saw it all. It made a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. Men like him were storms. You didn't know if they would pass over or tear the roof from your house. One afternoon, when the sun was at its highest and the dust hung in the air like a fine silt, he finally moved. The usual low hum of the market seemed to quiet as he crossed the square. Each step was measured, his spurs making no sound in the thick dust. He stopped before her cart. Up close, he was taller than she'd thought, and the lines on his face were deeper. He smelled of leather, dust, and something metallic, like old iron. "What's good?" His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was not a question so much as a demand for information. An Jing's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady. She had learned from her father that fear was a private matter. In public, you showed only what was necessary. She gestured with her chin toward the large pot simmering over the small fire. "Noodle soup," she said, her own voice barely a whisper, "with braised beef." He considered this for a moment, his pale eyes scanning the contents of her cart, the neatly chopped greens, the pale, coiled noodles, the rich, dark broth. He gave a single sharp nod. "One bowl." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. She ladled the steaming, fragrant broth into a clay bowl, added a careful portion of noodles, then topped it with tender slices of beef, a sprinkle of fresh greens, and a single, star-shaped piece of anise she'd fished from the pot. She slid the bowl and a wooden spoon across the worn surface of the cart. He laid 2 coins down, more than enough, and gestured for her to keep the change. He didn't take the bowl to a nearby bench. Instead, he stood right there, in the full glare of the sun and the town's collective stare, and began to eat. An Jing busied herself, wiping down a surface that was already clean, her gaze fixed on her own hands. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the square on them. She expected him to eat quickly, the way most men here did, as if food were just fuel. But he didn't. He ate slowly, deliberately. After the first spoonful, he paused, the spoon hovering over the bowl. His entire body went rigid. An Jing risked a glance up at him. His head was bowed slightly, his hat brim shadowing his face. He brought the spoon to his lips again, then a third time. He set the spoon down in the half-empty bowl with a soft clink. He did not move for a long moment. Then, with a slow, almost imperceptible movement, he raised a hand and drew the back of his thumb under his eye. A single tear. It was a small, impossible thing, a drop of water in the desert of his face. An Jing stared, her breath caught in her throat. This man, this hardened gunslinger whose name was whispered with a mix of awe and terror, was crying into her noodle soup. The sight was so incongruous, so deeply private and yet so terribly public, that she felt a strange protective urge to shield him from the gawking eyes of the town. He seemed to gather himself, a subtle shift in his shoulders, as if shrugging off a heavy coat. He picked up the bowl, drank the rest of the broth in 2 long swallows, and set it down firmly on the cart. His pale eyes met hers. They were raw, stripped of their usual coldness, and in them she saw a desolation that mirrored her own. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked away, his back as straight and unyielding as ever, leaving behind an empty bowl, too much money, and a silence that was louder than any gunshot. The town stared, first at his retreating back, and then at her. An Jing had never felt more exposed in her life. She did not yet know that the simple meal was not an ending, but the beginning of a reckoning for them both. The following day, the air around An Jing's cart was different. The stares were more frequent, the whispers more pointed. Some folks who had never given her a second glance now approached with a hesitant curiosity, their eyes darting around as if expecting Jasper Thorne to materialize from the dust. Business was better, but the attention felt heavy, like a woolen blanket on a summer day. She sold her food, her face a mask of calm neutrality, but inside a storm of questions raged. What had he seen in her soup? A memory? A ghost? Her answer arrived in the form of Marcus Bishop. Bishop owned the town's largest freight company and a significant portion of the land it was built on. He was a man who confused his wealth with worth, and he walked with the swagger of someone who believed the world owed him its deference. He was large and florid, his expensive suit always looking a size too tight, a sheen of sweat perpetually on his brow. He stopped his leisurely stroll directly in front of her cart, blocking the sun. "Well now," he boomed, his voice oozing a false cordiality that made An Jing's skin crawl. "It seems our little flower of the Orient is attracting some interesting clientele." An Jing said nothing, merely meeting his gaze before looking down to stir her pot. "I've been thinking," Bishop continued, ignoring her silence. "This is a prime spot you've got here, a very prime spot. A business in such a location requires protection. From vagrants, from trouble. A small contribution to the town's well-being would ensure things continue to run smoothly for you." She knew what he was asking for. It wasn't a contribution. It was a tax, one that would go directly into his pocket. It was the kind of casual cruelty the powerful often mistook for business. "I have no trouble," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Bishop's smile tightened. "Trouble can find anyone, girl, especially someone alone. A fire, a tipped-over cart, accidents happen every day. $1 a week would make sure no accidents happen to you." It was more than she could afford, and they both knew it. It was meant to break her, to force her out. She lifted her chin, her dark eyes holding his. "My parents taught me not to pay for something I do not need. I am fine on my own." "Are you now?" Bishop took a step closer, his bulk looming over her. He reached out a thick-fingered hand and poked the side of her steaming pot. "This is a flimsy setup. A strong wind could take it." "Then I will build it again." His face darkened with anger. He was not used to being defied, least of all by someone he considered so far beneath him. "You're a stubborn one. Maybe you need a more direct lesson in how things work in redemption." He raised his hand as if to sweep the bowls from her cart. "I wouldn't." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the afternoon heat like a shard of ice. Jasper Thorne stood 10 feet away, his thumbs hooked in his belt. He hadn't been there a second ago. He seemed to have simply appeared, a mirage of retribution shimmering in the heat. Marcus Bishop froze, his hand hovering in mid-air. He turned slowly, his bravado evaporating like a puddle in the sun. "Thorne, this is no concern of yours, just a business matter." "It is now," Jasper said, taking a slow step forward. He didn't look at Bishop. His pale eyes were fixed on Anjing, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "The lady said she doesn't need your protection. I'd consider that the end of the matter." "Now see here," Bishop blustered, trying to reclaim some of his authority. "This is my town. I won't be told what to do by a hired gun." Jasper's gaze finally shifted to Bishop, and the coldness in it was absolute. "You own some buildings, Bishop. You don't own the air, and you don't own the people. Leave her be." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The threat was plain, hanging in the silence between them. It was not a threat of a lawsuit or a fistfight. It was a promise of a final, deadly conclusion. The square had gone utterly silent. Everyone was watching. Marcus Bishop, a man who ruled by bluster and intimidation, was being faced down by a man who ruled by quiet, lethal competence. For a long moment, Bishop's face cycled through shades of red and purple. Humiliation warred with self-preservation. Self-preservation won. With a strangled curse, Bishop lowered his hand. "This isn't over," he snarled, not at Jasper, but at Anjing. He then turned and stalked away, his dignity in tatters. The tension in the square broke. People began to talk again, but their eyes kept flicking between the quiet gunslinger and the girl at the food cart. Jasper walked the remaining steps to her cart. He looked at the pot of soup, then at her. Her hands were gripping the edge of the cart so tightly her knuckles were white, but she stood tall. "Thank you," she said softly. He gave a slight nod. "A man like Bishop," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "he doesn't forget being shamed in public. He'll find another way." He reached into his pocket and placed a silver dollar on the cart for tomorrow's soup. He turned and left before she could protest. Anjing watched him go, the heavy coin warm in her palm. The immediate danger had passed, but his words lingered like a chill. A bigger threat was now visible, and she was standing directly in its path. That evening, as she was packing her cart to leave, he appeared again at the edge of the now empty square. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. This time there were no crowds, no prying eyes. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a request. She hesitated for only a second before nodding. She fell into step beside him, and they walked in silence toward the small creek that marked the town's southern edge. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was a shared space, weighted with unspoken things. They stopped by the water's edge where the cottonwoods grew thick. The sound of the creek was a gentle murmur. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why did you help me?" He didn't answer right away. He picked up a flat, smooth stone and turned it over in his calloused fingers. "The soup you make," he began, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "My mother made a soup like that. The same smell, the same taste." He looked out over the water, but she knew he was seeing something else entirely. "I wasn't raised out here. I was born in a port city, far from these mountains. My mother, she came from a place even farther away. She was a cook on a ship, and my father was a sailor. She had a small kitchen near the docks. She could make a feast out of fish heads and yesterday's bread. But her best dish was a noodle soup. She called it her memory soup." An Jing listened, captivated. She was seeing a new map being drawn over his weathered face, a history she never could have imagined. "She used ginger and that star-shaped spice," he continued. "She said it reminded her of home. She was always homesick. She died when I was 12. Fever. After that, my father took to the sea and never came back. I've been on my own since. For 20 years, I haven't tasted anything that even came close to her cooking. I thought the memory was gone for good." He looked at her then, and the desolation she'd seen in his eyes the day before was now laid bare. It was the profound grief of a boy who had lost everything. "When I tasted your soup, it was like she was standing right next to me. For a minute, I wasn't here. I was a boy in her kitchen again, safe." He closed his hand around the stone in his palm. "She used to keep a stone like this from a river near her village in her apron pocket. Said it kept her grounded." He opened his hand and showed it to An Jing. It was a simple gray river stone, worn smooth by time and touch. An Jing felt a profound ache of empathy for him. His loneliness was a mirror of her own. "My mother taught me," she said quietly. "She said food holds our stories. When we have nothing else, we still have the taste of home." A fragile understanding passed between them, stronger than any words. He was no longer just a gunslinger, and she was no longer just a cook. They were two solitary survivors, recognizing the same scars on each other. The next day, the other way Bishop had found to harm her arrived. The town clerk, a nervous man named Peters who was squarely in Bishop's pocket, delivered an official-looking notice. It declared that the patch of ground her cart occupied was, according to a newly discovered town charter from 1862, commercial land belonging to the Redemption Freight Company. She was trespassing and had 48 hours to vacate. It was a lie, a legal fiction designed to crush her. As a woman, and a Chinese one at that, she had no standing to fight it. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced through her carefully constructed composure. She would be cast out with nothing. She was staring at the paper, the words blurring through her tears, when Jasper's shadow fell over her. He took the notice from her trembling hand and read it. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. He saw the trap instantly. It was clever. It used the law as a weapon, a fight he couldn't win with a gun. He looked from the notice to her face, at the quiet devastation there. He saw her entire world, balanced on a single wooden cart, about to be kicked out from under her. He made a decision. It was swift, absolute, and it would change the course of his life forever. "He can't take land from a citizen's wife," Jasper said, his voice level and certain. Anjing looked up at him, confused. "Wife?" He met her gaze, his own eyes serious and unwavering. "Marcus Bishop is trying to take your cart. Let him try to take what belongs to the wife of Jasper Thorne." He took a breath. "Marry me, Anjing. Give me the right to protect you." It wasn't a declaration of love whispered in the moonlight. It was a proposal forged in the harsh light of a Nevada afternoon, a practical, desperate, and yet profoundly moving offer. It was a shield. It was a home. It was his entire life, his name, his formidable reputation, laid at her feet as a bulwark against the world. For the second time in 3 days, Anjing stood before this man, utterly speechless. 3 months later, the autumn chill began to creep into the Redemption air, but the corner of the square where Anjing had once kept her cart was a bubble of warmth and light. Jing's kitchen was painted in neat, clean letters on a sign that hung above a permanent structure. It was small, just a clapboard room with a proper stove, a service counter, and 4 sturdy wooden tables. But it was hers. Jasper had built it with his own hands, the sound of his hammer a steady, reassuring rhythm throughout the last days of summer. They had been married by the circuit judge the day after his proposal. It was a simple, quiet affair at the courthouse, with 2 bemused clerks as witnesses. Marcus Bishop had tried to contest the new arrangement, but he found no purchase. Threatening a lone girl was one thing. Threatening the wife of a man like Jasper Thorne was another. The town, which had once watched Anjing with suspicion, now treated her with a newfound respect. She was no longer a transient curiosity. She was Mrs. Thorne. Their life together settled into a quiet routine that was more comfortable than either of them had expected. He was the silent, steady presence at the edge of her world. He chopped the wood for her stove, hauled the water from the well, and his presence alone was enough to deter any trouble. In the evenings, after she closed the kitchen, he would sit at one of the tables while she counted the day's earnings, the soft clink of coins a peaceful sound in the small room. He rarely spoke of his past, and she did not ask. They understood that some wounds were best left undisturbed. Their home was a small cabin just outside of town that he had owned for years but had clearly spent little time in. Under her touch, it transformed. The dust was swept away, curtains appeared in the windows, and the scent of her cooking filled the small rooms, chasing out the ghosts of loneliness. She learned the small things about him, that he liked his coffee black, that he sometimes stared at the horizon for hours without speaking, and that the tense lines around his eyes softened only when he was sitting in her kitchen. One evening, after a particularly busy day, they sat together at one of the tables in the empty eatery. A single lantern cast a warm glow over the room. She had made a large bowl of noodle soup, and she placed it between them. It was a familiar ritual, a quiet communion that had replaced the need for conversation. He ate slowly, the way he had that first day. But this time was different. There was no tension in his shoulders, no storm in his eyes. He looked across the table at her, his gaze gentle. The gunslinger was gone, and in his place was just a man, a husband. "I never thought," he said, his voice low, "that I'd ever have a home again." "You did not have a home," Anjing replied softly, a small smile touching her lips. "You built one." He looked around the small kitchen, at the sturdy walls he had raised, at the warm light, at the woman sitting across from him. He knew she was not just talking about the building. A home was not just wood and nails. It was a place where the ghosts of the past could finally rest. It was the quiet certainty of knowing there was a table waiting for you at the end of the day. He picked up his spoon and took another mouthful of soup. The taste was no longer a painful memory of what was lost. It was the comforting, solid taste of his life, right here, right now. He looked at his wife, her face serene in the lantern light, and he felt something loosen in his chest. A knot of grief he had carried for 20 years finally coming undone. There was no tear this time. There was only a quiet, profound sense of peace. He had come to her cart seeking a memory and had found a future instead. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.